Hello, Julie. Welcome to the show today. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me,
Yeah,
Lindsay.
I'm excited to have you on the show. So, for our listeners, today I have Julie Holunga on the show. Julie is a leadership speaker and trainer helping develop communication skills that were never taught in school. I totally understand that. She grew up in Paris, New Delhi, Hong Kong, and New York City, and worked at Harvard University helping alumni advance their careers. And Julie hosted a TED Talk in November of 2020 entitled Don't Let Your Words Sabotage Your Career. Welcome again, Julie. Your TED Talk title really caught my eye.
Thank you, Lindsay. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to have that conversation, and I love talking about language with all my clients
Yeah.
and people like you.
Yes, I love it. And so tell me a little bit about how you got into this track in your career around communications. Was there
Sure.
some kind of original experience you had or something that really got you into coaching on communication and how important it is?
Yes. So as you said, I grew up in overseas,
Mm-hmm.
and I started elementary school in Paris. So I walked in that first day of class and of school in a uniform,
Oh,
in a very scratchy wool gray and blue uniform, and noticed that no one else was wearing this uniform. So there had been some language
oh
barrier
yeah.
that my mom and
Oh
I,
no.
didn't connect with, but it was in that moment, and I can remember that vividly of, okay, there is this disconnect.
Yeah.
And then figuring out, being 6 years old, figuring out, obviously upon reflection, that I could communicate, right? We went, I feel very lucky that my recess in elementary school was in the shadows of the Eiffel
Oh,
Tower,
that's
right?
amazing. That is
It
amazing.
was
Yeah.
amazing. And I could figure out how to communicate in that setting, right? Like whatever we were playing,
Yeah.
the French version of kickball or whatever it was, I was able, even without the words, to communicate. And in fact, that's what the science has shown is why young kids are able to learn language, a different language, so quickly, because they're not thinking about, I don't know what I'm saying, or
Right.
I don't have the right accent, or so we're out of our heads when we're young
Yes.
compared to us as adults trying to learn a
I
language,
love it.
right? Um, so that was such a stamp in my life, and those 7 years living abroad, consistently being the outsider, needing to communicate sometimes in ways that were different than what I was used to,
Yeah.
learning new ways of new behaviors, new body language,
Hmm.
with each culture that it changed. I mean, vastly different between Paris and New Delhi and Hong Kong, three very different cultures and ways of communicating. And I had to learn that. And it wasn't, obviously it was not a conscious thing
Right.
that I was doing, but it was something. But I do remember a lot of conversations with different people at school or in our community
Mhm.
about communications. And I remember vividly. So I was in seventh grade, leaving Hong Kong to move back to New York.
Yep.
And all of the international, everyone was international. We were at an international school.
Okay.
Uh, Everyone who was moving back to their home environment was brought into a counselor,
Right.
and we would have weekly sessions to help us reintegrate and prepare for moving back.
Okay.
And I remember this really young, what I remember being a very young, skinny guy
Yeah.
telling us, when you move back, no one cares that you have just had this unbelievable experience.
Right.
And no one will understand what it was like
Yeah.
to be at school where kids were coming in and out every 6 months.
Right.
And that you lived in this unbelievable place, and they will think that you don't know how to speak English,
Oh.
even though you're American and you were born there and you may have even known these same people.
Hmm.
And that has stuck with me to this day, that don't talk about that experience. And it takes a lot
Hmm.
to get it out of me.
Yeah.
And I've been coached to talk about it more often. But even like the day after my husband and I were married,
Mhm.
we had been together for 6 years at that point. We went to hang out with his family, and something came up about me growing up overseas.
Right.
And my sister in law said, how have I never heard about this? It's been
Interesting.
6 years. But that was so ingrained in
Right.
me.
Don't talk about it.
Don't
It's
talk about it.
yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
and I would say that's obviously bad advice.
Right, 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 for sure, for
But
sure.
just right, the communication that it's how we interact, it's how we build trust with people. And when I then went into the workforce and was working at Harvard University and, felt very like I have no experience, I don't know what I'm doing.
Mhm.
And I worked with some amazing people that first job right out of school who didn't care that I didn't have experience. And they wanted me to take a seat at the table,
Hmm.
like proverbial and real table.
Yep.
And they would talk to me and say, don't tell people you don't know what you're talking about. Don't tell people you've never
Ooh,
done this before.
okay.
They're amazing, amazing people. I'm still in touch with some of them, which, is great
Yeah.
decades later.
No,
Um,
that's wonderful.
but really had that impact on me. Like,
Mhm.
pay attention to the words that you're using, pay attention to your body language.
Okay.
So those two experience really honed in on
Yes,
the
I love it.
that advice that was, not so good and then really
Right,
great to
right.
help me
But it's
professionally.
yeah, I like the combination of the 2, right? So you've lived all over the
Yeah.
world as a very young child, very kind of impressionable age, but you were
Yes,
able it sounds like you were able to thrive, you were able to make it work, and partially because kids don't have that filter, that self-consciousness,
totally.
right? So you built those
Right.
connections. On this show, we talk a lot about connection, and we say connection, not perfection. That's our trademark, it's our
Yeah.
slogan.
Yes.
It sounds like you did that successfully,
Yeah.
and then you came home and maybe there was some self-consciousness brought on. Don't talk about where you were. You'll be
Right.
considered different. And then
Right.
someone reminded you, hey, don't say, I don't know what I'm doing. Just take your seat
Right.
and give what you have to give and don't let your words undermine you. Is that right?
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
love
Yep.
that. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's where we're going to go today for our audience, for our listeners. Again, the title of your TED Talk was Don't Let Your Words Sabotage Your Career. And I liked your opening example of specifically what women tend to say when they are accepted, when they are offered a job or a promotion, they question
Right.
that, right? But
Yes.
I was thinking today, Julie, you could show us 3 language choices that all of our listeners might want to avoid, ways of framing things that we
Yep.
tend to do that we should stop doing because it is hurting our career if we're working in English. Does that sound like a good
Yes.
plan?
Yes, that's great. And I have so many, but I'll narrow it down for
Okay,
you.
let's start with
The
number
first
1. I'm
one,
excited. Let's jump
yeah,
in.
the first one, and this can be culturally different.
Yes,
So of course, all of this advice is pay attention to your environment
of course.
and who you're working with. But the first one I always talk about is not apologizing when you don't need to own a mistake or something not happening.
Okay, give us an
I
example of what
see
you
this.
mean by owning a mistake.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of a client of mine who was responsible for pulling together materials for a board meeting.
Mhm.
And the CFO, quarter after quarter, did not send her the materials on time.
Oh,
So she would be scrambling, or they wouldn't get into the binder, or the materials.
right.
He would look bad, she would look bad. There was all kinds of things
Mm.
not working, and she tried everything. She worked with his assistant. She
Oh.
gave him a false early deadline. She went to his office. She called him. I mean, she really was trying everything
Oh.
to help him look good.
Right. Sure.
And he came to her one day fuming, like, how did you not include my stuff, and now I look bad to the board. And she then said, well, I'm sorry, but you didn't get things to me on time.
Right. Yes.
And yeah, and this was not her fault.
So she's
This was not
apologizing
her
for something
wrongdoing.
that was he aware that he was late delivering the materials or
Oh, yes. Yes. And by the way, he wasn't late by like an hour. It was like 3 days.
Oh gosh.
It was due on that example, it was due on a Tuesday. He got it to her Friday afternoon. Like, the
No.
materials had gone out. The meeting was on Monday. Like,
No. Yeah. Okay.
and so was he aware? I hope so, Lindsay, but I don't know for sure. But what she told me was that after she apologized for it, she had this sense that there was a shift, and she had the sense that she had made a mistake, and she didn't
Mm.
know exactly what it was, and And then we, in lots of conversations, we figured out like she owned his mistake.
Mhm. Mhm.
So then she started owning more of his mistakes,
Oh, wow. So that was kind of a
right?
gateway to saying sorry more
Yes,
often then?
yes.
Interesting.
And then taking the blame.
Okay. Okay.
So then he started publicly blaming
Oh,
her.
no. Oh my gosh. Okay. This
Yes,
is becoming toxic.
because
Yeah.
she owned it. She took
Ugh, not
responsibility.
good. Yeah.
So we shifted it. And I said to her, "Why were you apologizing? What was going on?" She said, "I felt for him. He looked bad. He was frustrated."
Mhm.
Well,
Mhm.
of course,
Mhm.
of
Mhm.
course. But you can change the language. And so what she said, instead of saying, "I'm sorry," was she said, "I hear your frustration.
Okay. Okay.
What can I do to help you?" And she said it was unbelievable the shift that happened because she saw him visibly relax. His shoulders went down.
Interesting.
And then what eventually happened is he apologized and he owned up that it was his fault. But
Mm.
when she was apologizing to him, he wasn't taking responsibility. It wasn't changing his behavior.
Ooh,
So, really paying attention to what you're apologizing for.
right.
If you're late, if you miss a deadline,
Of
apologize.
course. If it's your mistake, right?
It's your mistake, but just be conscious of
Right.
that.
Don't apologize for other people's mistakes, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Don't own it when it's not yours to own.
That is really good. That's such a great example of maybe she wasn't very conscious initially that she was doing
No,
that, but then it became really clear
exactly.
and slid into a bigger problem. And as soon as she flipped that,
Exactly.
it's all about those words. They matter so much. They set the tone for the
Right.
interaction and the power relationship, right, between her and
Exactly.
her boss. I love that.
Right.
So, is there
Right.
a second thing that we might want to
Yeah.
avoid then, Julie? I'm going to keep us
Yeah.
moving through, but I love that first
Yeah.
example. What would be the second
Yeah.
one that we should avoid doing?
So the second one is paying attention to when you're using conditional language.
Tell us more.
Like, I think this is a good idea. I believe we should take this course of action. It's conditional. You're planting, subconsciously maybe, but you're planting a seed of doubt in your audience.
Mhm. Mhm. For sure.
And if you are right, if you're in a position of influence, or you're trying to influence, or you're trying to make a sale, or you're trying to get more budget,
Yeah.
you want your audience to feel your confidence. So instead of using that conditional language, use declarative. So I suggest, I recommend,
Interesting.
from my experience.
Hmm.
I get a lot of pushback from people on this,
Really?
telling me if I use that language, it's gonna come back to bite me.
And that's
It's gonna
because
come
do they feel like they're putting too much of themselves, too much of an endorsement on it when they say, "I suggest, I recommend"?
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Hmm.
And what I say to them is, look, if you're in a brainstorming session, then yeah, you can use I think, I
Sure.
believe.
That's a different
But if
context.
you are influencing a client, if you are trying to influence a colleague, like I said, trying to get budget,
Hmm.
you by standing in a strong position of conviction
Yes.
and using declarative language, if you're going to get pushback, better to get pushback from that standpoint than from a weak standpoint of, well, maybe this would be a good idea. I'm not really
Right,
sure.
right. You wanna get pushback
Right.
on the actual substance of the ideas, not the way you're framing
Yeah,
the ideas. You don't
exactly.
want that to
And then
taint. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, and then the focus is on the idea or the
Yes.
recommendation as opposed to on you as a leader.
So I love that. So just to make sure our listeners got that, use declarative language. I suggest we do this. I recommend we do that instead of conditional. I believe these feel a little weaker. And I think for our listeners, an added layer of challenge that we want to focus on is when we translate directly from our native language, there may be certain native languages that are pushing us more in the direction of the conditionals. I believe. So
Right,
that is something I want our listeners to think about, guys, as you are taking today's advice. Think about what are the direct translations, and are you translating directly, and how could we reframe that into more declarative
exactly.
language? That is really interesting. That is a new one that I haven't thought about, but it makes total sense. Suggest and
Right.
recommend also feel more professional.
Exactly,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And Lindsay, you just did it perfectly because your tone was very neutral.
Mhm. Yeah.
So if people can pay attention to their tone, where it's not overly aggressive, like, we have to do this.
Right.
That
That's too much.
people are like, whoa, 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 right? But if you find this neutral, I recommend we do this.
Yeah.
And then to follow it with a question. How does that sit with you? What do you think? What
Hmm.
pushback could we get? That tends to start the conversation. But again, you're in this really strong position of engaging,
Yeah.
building trust.
Right. So it's not that you're not looking for feedback or not open to feedback. It's just that you're framing the feedback as a question after you've made your recommendation, right?
Exactly.
Perfect.
Exactly.
All right, Julie, let's move
Right.
on to your third tip. What would be the third
So the
tip?
third
Yeah.
tip is to not undermine yourself. Don't tell people what you're not. Like what the example I gave to you,
Mhm.
you know, starting out my career, I don't know anything. I didn't know anything,
Right.
but I
No
don't
one
need
knows
to tell
anything when they
anyone
start
that.
their career. Who does?
Right, right, right. The expectation wasn't that I knew everything, but don't tell people. And it blows me away, Lindsay. Like I hear best-selling authors, I hear tenured professors, experts in their field sitting, you know, on panels or on guests on podcasts saying, well, you know, I'm just a professor in this. I
Ooh.
haven't written a book. Or I'm just an author, but I'm, you know, everyone else here on the panel is professors.
Hmm.
Or literally saying, I'm not an expert in this.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have to be the expert, but you probably are the expert in the room.
Right. You're on the panel for a reason, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. Just is a dangerous word, isn't it? We've done a couple of episodes talking about how just can really undermine. And we see women,
absolutely.
especially, using just a lot, but just in general, being really careful and listening to yourself when you do use just, especially when you're talking about your own career portfolio or your skills. Right, Julie?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And what I always tell people is you may use just when it's in reference to time. This just happened, right? But you can't
That's it.
say, I just wrote a book. Or someone,
Right.
one of my colleagues from the TED Talk, the cohort, said, well, I've just done a TED Talk. No, no,
No,
no.
no,
Like,
no. You mean
no.
yesterday you did a TED Talk? Is that what you mean?
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Oh, I love this.
Yeah.
This is so I wish we could talk longer, Julie. We're running out of time here today, but this has been fantastic. You know, you've given us a chance to really reflect on some subtle things that may slip into our language. We might not be aware of how that's setting a tone in terms of a relationship, a path a relationship goes down, or how
Yeah.
people look at our own expertise. It's up to us to show, how qualified we are, right?
That's
That
right.
is so good. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much for being on the show. Julie, where can our listeners find out more about you? Do you have a podcast or a book you could let us know about, or should we go to
Yeah.
your TED Talk? Where should we learn more?
Yeah. So you can go to my website, julieholunga.com.
Hmm.
And on LinkedIn, I love connecting with people and hearing, oh, I've eliminated this word and I've added this word.
Yeah.
And yes, my TED Talk can be found on YouTube, on TED.com. Don't let your words sabotage your career.
Excellent.
And I really encourage our listeners to, as you said, to slow down and think about communicating clearly and directly so that they are able to influence those around them.
So good. And could you spell your URL, your website? Just spell your name for
Sure.
us. Hmm.
Sure. It's www.julie, JuliEHolunga.com.
All right. Excellent. So I want to encourage our listeners, guys, go over there, check out the other things that Julie has going on. Definitely check out the TED Talk. Super powerful topic and very important, Julie. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been great chatting with you today.
Thank you,
All
Lindsay.
right. You have a good day.
You too.
Bye.